In this video, we're going to talk about how to manage your money like the rich. So I believe that there's 5 things that the rich and the wealthy do differently than the poor.
So Ken, what's the biggest difference between the rich and the poor?
The biggest difference is their mindset. So I can say this from experience because I grew up with a poor mindset. My parents had poor mindsets. They always said we can't afford something. And only later in life did I realize, how can we afford something? And so that's the biggest differentiation, in my opinion. I think what happens is the poor, they spend whatever they make, and then they invest afterwards. Where the rich, they actually invest first, and then they look for the cash flow from those investments to spend. So the rich, they invest and then spend, and the poor, they spend and then they invest. That's probably one of the bigger things that I see as the difference.
How do the rich view assets and liabilities versus how do the poor view assets and liabilities?
Really what the rich do is they focus on building their asset column. And that's probably the biggest thing. In other words, a lot of people think their equity in their home as an asset, or what's in their bank account or their 401k, and those are real assets. But the rich actually take it to a whole new level. They're trying to build their asset column on income-producing real estate, income-producing businesses, and things like that. And they're really growing that asset column. The other thing is I found that the poor often look at liabilities as bad. And I think that in a lot of cases they can be. They can be like there's what I call good debt and there's bad debt. Good debt is debt that's used to buy assets. Bad debt would be, let's say, a car loan. And I have a car loan. So I'm just saying that you need to just know the difference. Credit card debt is bad debt. And so those are liabilities. And so what happens a lot of times is people, the poor grow the liability column so that they can barely make it. And so right now we're seeing that in student loan debt, for example. And I'm not saying that education isn't a good investment. What I'm saying is that it's a tough liability to get out from, as you're barely making money. So knowing the difference between asset growth and liabilities is a huge factor, I think, in your overall game plan.
Ken, what are some of the tax and legal strategies that the rich do that the poor don't do?
The first thing that I learned on the legal side is that if you put your things into an LLC or a limited liability company or a C Corp or an S Corp, those are different kinds of legal entities. Those are considered businesses or entities. You have a great deal of asset protection inside of there. So, for example, let's say like McElroy.com. That's an entity. Well, if somebody sues me on something on McElroy.com, they actually sue a corporation or a company. And so they have to what's called pierce the corporate veil. So things that you're doing inside of a company can be very, very important, even if it's a small business. So let's say you have a small consulting business and you're running across town and you run a red light and you hit somebody and they sue you. Well, and you're out on business. So if your assets are inside of a corporation, it's gonna be a lot harder to penetrate that corporation to get at your personal assets. That's number one. People use entities for protecting their homes and protecting their businesses and protecting all kinds of things. Very, very, very common and legal. And so that's the first thing. The other thing that I found is when I started my own businesses, there are certain things like my car that I use. Like I probably use my car 70 to 80% for business. Driving around looking at properties, I'm all over the state, driving around, going to meeting with all kinds of people. Well, you can take a lot of expenses, even a home office, and it all has to be legit. You have to be actually doing things from your home, which I do. I work from home a lot. And so those are things that you can actually write off. So they're real expenses. And so you take what would normally be just normal day-to-day living, and you can start running things through. Like let's say if I have a business lunch, then I can actually write that business lunch off. And there are things that you can do for entertaining and all kind. Now the laws have changed a lot, so you have to be really crystal clear on what you can and can't do. And I'm certainly not the expert for that, but there's a lot of things that you can do inside of an entity for asset protection and for being able to write things off to lower your personal expenses on things that you're doing to grow. On the tax side, this is probably the part that's blown me away the most. And if you haven't had a chance to see Tom Wheelwright's videos, he's a master at this stuff. He understands tax like nobody. And the tax laws are really set up for people to use. They say, these are the things that you can legally do in order to reduce your taxes. And so those are the things that I've learned over time is there are certain things that the government gives you. Like a lot of people remember when the alternative fuel cars, for example, right? That was a tax incentive. People went out and bought all those cars, they all alternative fuel license plate. That's what I'm talking about. And so those are things like that are available in business too. Like we provide housing. And so the government gives us tax benefits to provide housing, and they do it in mining. They want oil and gas, and so there's tax incentives if you invest in oil and gas. I'm not saying that those are all great investments. What I'm saying is that there are tax pieces inside of there that can reduce your overall income. So there's a lot of people invest looking for tax strategies as well. And so those are the kinds of things that I've learned that the difference between the rich and the poor do. Because the poor, typically, the poor mindset, they usually put their money in savings.
So around managing money, what's the difference between the way the rich manage their money and the way the poor manage their money?
Well, I think this has a lot to do with being passive or active. And so I fell into this category as a young man. When I first got out of college, I remember putting $2,000 with somebody and then opening the statement every quarter and seeing if it grew or not. And generally it didn't grow at all. I didn't understand all the fees and all the financial planning and all the stuff behind all that at the time. But I was doing what everybody did, is taking some of my money and sticking it with somebody and then working hard. And I think a lot of times people never ever sway from that. So they work their butts off, and then they put all their money into whatever it is. Usually it's some kind of a vehicle with some company. And I'm not saying those are bad things to do. It is a way to invest. But I think that that's a very, very passive way to invest. That I think it's horrible that people can go 20, 30 years and not really understand how their portfolio is doing without actively managing it. And I think it happens a lot. And I certainly fell into this category. And only after a while did I realize that the rich actually don't do that. Most of the people I know do not invest in 401ks. Most of them are not in the stock market because those are very, very hard things to invest in and do very, very well. Now, I'm not saying you can't make money in those things, but what I'm saying is that what I found is that the rich are much more active. So I'll just give you an example. This weekend I was meeting with a friend of mine, and we're actually going to set up a little board. It's called Rogue Capital, and we're all going to invest in tech deals and businesses and real estate, all through a collective group of people that are all smart in a lot of different ways. And so we're all learning together, because as deal flows come, we can all discuss them openly and actively. We can look at different things, and everybody has different expertise and different skill sets. And so that, I think, is the difference, is that I'm actively, yes, I'm a real estate guy, but I also invest in a lot of businesses and gold and silver. And, I've done plenty of stock trading and things like that as well. And I've invested in gold mines and silver mines and things like that. And so, but I'm actively doing it, and I'm actually investing directly, where I think a lot of times people hand their money over to somebody and they just don't know, or they meet with them once a year or once a quarter. And I just think that's horrible. I think you should be really, really, really understand. With so much on the line, I think you should really understand who is managing your money, what kind of fees they're taking, and why. That's the biggest question, is why.
When it comes to money and what it actually is, the rich think about it a certain way and the poor think about it a certain way. What is money to the rich?
Money changed in the early 70s when Nixon took the United States off of the gold standard. And I think a lot of people, certainly I was a young man, or young boy actually, I don't recall that. I don't remember what it was like before that. But my parents did. And so what that meant before the early 70s was that a dollar was tied to the gold standard. So you remember as a kid, Fort Knox, and thinking about that and how cool that is, and all the money and all the gold in Fort Knox, all that. That's actually what it was. It was tied to the dollar. Well, when the dollar became what's called free floating, or a guy like Mike Maloney would call it fiat currency, what a fiat currency means is that it's now not tied to anything. And so the U.S. or the Federal Reserve can actually they can actually grow the money supply. They can actually grow it to pay for debts and things like that. They can actually add. And so all that does is it takes what would be considered, something that was a little more stable to something that was less stable. It can be devalued. So if you really want to take a look, just take a look at how much the dollar's devalued in the last 15 years. Just Google it and you'll see, it'll freak you out. So now here's the interesting thing, is a dollar's a dollar's a dollar. So if I had a dollar, let's say, back in early 2000s, it's still the same dollar. It just buys less. That's the only difference. And so if your bank account was 10 grand in 2000, it's still 10 grand today, all it means is that it buys a lot less. And so I think what happens is the poor, they save. This is why Robert Kiyosaki says savers are losers. Because they don't understand that inflation's eroding their purchasing power of their own money. And so let's just say inflation's been 2% over the last 10 years. Well, that means that there's been a 20% devaluation in your currency. Now, it actually buys a lot less, right? And so that's all it means. And so as a kid, I don't know about you, but I never saw a $100 bill. Now, I see so many of them, they're like 20s used to be, and that's a result of that. And so what the rich do is they look for investments that hedge currency. So they look for things like real estate that goes up as the dollar devalues, because this is the interesting discussion around debt. So people say get out of debt, get out of debt, get out of debt, get out of debt, and there's lots of gurus that say get out of debt. And for some people, they probably should. But for me, if I have you just look at like your parents' house, for example. If your parents bought a house 20 years ago and it's a $200,000 house and they have $150,000 of debt, the chances that a house being worth a lot more is pretty high. And the debt has now gone down because the dollar is devalued. So it's devaluing debt at the same time it's devaluing your equity that might be in your bank. And so, money is just interesting because as it becomes devalued over time through this fiat currency and through the growing of the money supply, then you can just hedge it. You just want to invest in things that go up along the same lines. And I think a lot of times people invest in things that go down. So that's one of the primary differences in the way that people look at currency versus wealth. Is it, some people try to put all their money in cash, and some people try to invest as much as they can and ride along and let the economy and let the inflation and everything not erode your hard-earned money. So if you're ready to start managing your money like the rich, then be the first to learn from my latest videos by subscribing to my YouTube channel and visiting kenmcelroy.com to become a free member and access more of my content inside of my private community.